de spreker is. En dat is Kerste Geers. Dus graag Kerste en de inleiding van uw kant.
Thank you. So I will do it in English, also for the simple fact that Pezo and Sofia are here and will do it in English too, and speak English. Can you dim the light, please? I will keep it very short because, of course, you're all here to see the lecture of Pezo and Sofia and myself. I'm also extremely curious about that. I would say I have had the luck in the last many years to encounter them first and to grow an amazing affinity with them. And I would say that would count for both David and myself, in the sense that we felt that the way they were dealing with architecture from the very first buildings we saw, we felt very related to that. Now, somehow, a little bit by coincidence, came this bizarre term called the Hidden Valley. It was a little title of an even smaller text written by Pezo, when David sent him this strange picture. And somehow by putting the two key issues next to one another, there was something like a space in between, which we seemed to share. And as much as a coincidence as it was of course also very short, one after the other in time. And Pezo pointedly remarked that, as a matter of fact, they were put in the wrong order, as if ours prefigured theirs. Now, as much as you can contemplate on this, I feel that if we do share something extremely specific, I feel it is exactly that what somehow is conveyed with what is the architecture and that what is left in between. So to a certain extent, that despite the fact that we believe, all four of us, if I can say it that way, in the extreme power of the form of architecture and hence the desire to express its resistance, that despite all this, and that's the second and last picture I would like to show you, it is that resistance which allows life to unfold. And here it's a picture I took about a year and a half earlier when I was at their house. It was just finished, their house and their office, a beautiful building which I would not like to explain too much about. I expect and I hope very much that they will do that themselves. But I noticed this, the light was going down, it was dusk, and you see the clothes there hanging to be drying. And that very particular beautiful view of a building which for once was not depicted as a sculptural object, but rather as an obstruction which was able to organize the beauty of life which was unfolding, I felt was that what I had to share with you and share with them, in the hope that it's a life we can share much longer together.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirsten.
I don't know if we can maybe kill the lights, especially the ones that are in our faces. Well, thank you very much, Kirsten, and thank you for this invitation. Can we also turn this down? Yes, it's very awkward. We have been working together for, I would say, over a decade, 12 years, and we have a very small office, very small projects. So what we want to share with you tonight is more of a transversal section of our work. Unfortunately, there are no direct questions afterwards, but we can always discuss outside. If you have questions, it would be lovely to then talk.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Well, we want to talk and share with you something that is very specific to our approach to architecture. As Sofia told you, we work in far away in Chile in a small practice with small commissions and in a very intimate way. Well, we're married, so everything is connected. So extremely intimate. So we want to share with you both this body of work, of build work, not so much as a single project, And at the same time, our approach, our method, we call it method, which is different from a process. I don't know if you're familiar with the Chilean map, with the Chilean geopolitical definition. Well, that's a map projected in the back of an artist. We live more or less in the central area, which is, I don't know, we cannot be too pretentious by living there. But for us, it's very important to think about architecture as a form of knowledge, to understand that what we produce is not only an abstraction or an idea or an idealization of reality, but it's the very understanding of a place, of the relationship that we can have with a place. So not only in a technical dimension, but more in a cultural one, we really like the figure of this brick oven and the unskilled worker, because it is very clear to depict something that is a kind of a machine that produces raw material with raw material and a unit of force that can be applied to any unspecific work. So in other words, we're fascinated by the possibility of doing something that is nothing new.
And there are two figures that we like very much to understand how we face reality. One is the figure of the bull ring, which somehow replaces the notion of form by the notion of format. A format being only a size, a dimension, an outline, a field of action where you can move inside freely. And the second object that we call a perfect machine is the plan, the grid. It is an idea that you can superimpose on a reality and that is already in its nature destined to fail or to adapt to any situation. So we like to think of our projects in that way, that we can already have a method that anticipates or a degree of control of what we're doing.
And that perhaps faces the future with a certain fear, with a certain uncertainty. So we think of project as a plan that is both determined by an idea or that idealization or very schematic idealization of what we want, but at the same time it's modified and redefined by the accidents and by the circumstances. So the production of architecture that we want to do it's basically understood as a insertion of a piece of an object in a given place, in a given nature, and that placement of that something, it's basically a positioning that occurs in a certain moment. So it's basically the project, the plan, and the objects are basically instants in a given moment.
Or also to understand the project as a device to measure something or to introduce some abstract measure into a place. In this case, in New York, it's just a simple grid of 2,800 red sacks placed in a 3-meter grid, but that emphasize an existing information that is already there, and also emphasize the imperfection of building ideals as such. Or another project that is made of fragments in which this building, a 2,500 square meter building, is built of 100 pieces of 5x5 cloth. So it's a square inserted in nature, a square in terms of its shape, but also in terms of what it does. People can gather there. And it's a soft roof that oscillates. There's no structure, so the only thing that holds it together is the wind passing through and oscillating through, and also has a relation to the geography, the topography, what is happening around it.
And there is another subject that is very, for us, relevant for how we want to think about what we do, which is to understand that a building has a structure, not a physical one, but a formal one. So instead of defining the project according to the material, we really like to see buildings as spatial structures, and structures that are more relationship more than the shape in itself. And considering that since space doesn't have any value in itself, you can define a specific structure despite of the resources or the lack of resources. And in theoretical terms, that's something that it's very connected to a more topological understanding of space. So it's not descriptive, it's not analytical, but basically the definition of a relationship, which is very, it's part of our understanding, this childhood or infantile understanding of reality. So, for example, this is a fragment of a work of an Argentinian artist, and we would like to depict our project in this way because there is a clear coincidence between the method of production and the subject that is depicting. There is something that is very precise within the informality and perhaps this conflict between what is defined as form and which is something very rational, and the irrationality of the occupation, similar to the image that Kirsten was commenting.
This is, for those of you who have been to Buenos Aires, this is a picture taken in front of the obelisk, but looking the other way. And we think it's very clear of our context. What we call the New World is a superimposition of lots of influences. They're all simultaneous, they're all as important, and they're all coexisting. So we're always dealing with this. You don't have it, Europeans, you're very lucky because you have grown those models over time. But we have been somehow faced with them simultaneously, and we have to try to make sense or to somehow codify it in our own ways and extract information, trying to understand the values behind. So we have explored that through academic exercises. So since distance doesn't allow us to visit the masterpieces, we have to translate them in some way. In this case, the original photos on one side, and on your right-hand side, 1 to 10 models made by our students, where they have to somehow learn another way of translating the same information. Or the opposite direction, which is a bottom-up translation, where we take images from precarious context and have, in this case, students in the United States learn from a new set of values that they don't normally work with.
In this case, this is an exercise of documentation of domestic architecture of living rooms. So it's a reconstruction of 200 living rooms of our region that are inserted into this couple of towers of 1 units per block. And it's very clear how there is perhaps an obvious contradiction between the rigidity and rationality of architecture and this richness and informality of life. But what is more striking, at least for us, is to confirm that those patterns of domesticity are even more codified by rules and by dogmas that are even more terrible than the architectural ones. And it's something that we have confirmed also in a student building that we built.
3 biennales ago, we did a curatorial research for the Chilean government, where we were interested in exploring the notion of cultural identity, the Chilean cultural identity, but through objects that might seem very natural to us architects. We're used to working with scale, but that belong to the popular culture, in this case, souvenirs. So we did a documentation. We picked up in every market of the country the objects that people consider important. The moment they build a souvenir, it means it's part of their identity or understanding of that place. And then did a fictional exercise of transforming the modern buildings we thought were important in Chile into souvenirs and placing them all together as in a fair, in a market, and trying to understand up to what point is meaning independent of scale.
In this other exhibition, we were invited to do a show in a new gallery of architecture in Mexico City, and it was a tiny gallery that was perhaps too tiny for our ambitions. So we decided to do a huge museum with a retrospective. So we invented a machine to display our work. So it's basically the repetition of a single room that in every room there is a different project with models in the center and photographs and paintings. And since it's a ring, there is no beginning or end. But for us, the most important point is the collapse of the fiction, because our museum was a 1 to 10 museum inside the gallery with an exhibition 1 to 20 inside. So there is this moment of overlap of reality that was very relevant for the gallery in itself, because there was this confusion of images that were circulating about the gallery and the museum at the same time. This is a series of photographs. It's a fragment of a larger series that are depicting what we call normal architecture, which is something that is clearly made by non-architects. And what we like about them is that you can recognize a certain sense of familiarity. You feel that you know these places. And at the same time, there is a certain sense of rationality, but in places that are really distant from what we know as modern, but they are rational. So in that familiarity, we see a very basic lesson, which is how to produce a specific grammar, a specific articulation of elements without inventing a new language.
And in that sense, for example, this pavilion we did is taking a very normal element, a door, and then making the notion of it, or the basic notion of limit, very relative. It's 5 perimeters, 120 doors, and somehow it's always critical, because what is the interior, where is exterior, what is public, what is private, what is individual or collective. It's all supported by a steel structure, the same in every direction, and was a very enigmatic presence when it was from the outside in the park. But then with a very blurry material condition, it was all painted black, so actually the exterior landscape was a little bit reflected in the inside. We had a program of doors opening differently, and then all the doors were donated to social housing, and what remained was the structure, which is almost indestructible because it doesn't have any matter, almost.
This is a more recent pavilion in Lisbon. It's an exercise on centrality. It's a basic cross, a wooden cross on top of a flat concrete volume. So it's basically a kind of expression of a displacement of the center. There is a slight asymmetry in the plan and in the perception of that inner room that is visible from outside according to the distance between the column and the wall. So the construction is very basic, very elemental. It's columns, beams, and in the middle point there is a stress moment, a vertical point of tension, of gravity, that is highlighted by this suspended rock that somehow interrupts there is a charge void in between the rock and the surface. There is a fall that is interrupted. And that quality of infrastructure is somehow blended with the surroundings.
Another project that deals with the notion of gravity, but in this sense it's not pulling downwards, but we're actually trying to go upwards, is this pavilion in Denver. We did about a year ago. And it connects two parts of the city center with a university campus. It's organized in 5 levels, and it's a very slender tower to the pedestrians who are crossing from one point to the other, but it's also intersecting a main highway in the city, so it acts as a billboard in relation to the distance of the car and the speed of the car. This was an exercise in reduction, but not because of smaller elements. It was just a reduction in the amount of elements that make the structure. So the structure is organized in 5 levels, just decreasing as you go up, and it was all then covered with the same texture and some stones in the base that make it very, very stable. It's a very perfumed and shady corridor, almost a chapel-like interior to cross the highway.
And this is a more recent construction in London. It's an exhibition precisely about architecture, and that is paradoxically trying to avoid the representation of architecture in a place that is very representative in itself. So our proposal is a very primitive building type. It's a series of columns, cylindrical columns, and a horizontal plate, which is a mixture of a hut or a belvedere, a baldacchino, sorry, with a minimum amount of space in between the legs. So it occupies one of the largest rooms in this classical building, with a very simple alignment to the central axis. So it's an object very, very compact, with the 4 columns supporting the horizontal plate. But inside every column there is a staircase, so you can access the platform through these spiral staircases, and there is an additional circulation, a promenade against the back wall.
The piece is rotated in relation to the rectangular room, and that creates a distortion of the perspective, but also a distortion of the scale of this object. And so then once you are on top, on the platform, this is a hidden space, a hidden room, where you're in connection with the vaulted ceilings, with the skylights, with the angels and the decoration on top, and have no relation to the lower stratum of normal movement of that gallery space. All of this was prefabricated with pine wood, with simple wood in Chile. It was then shipped in 2 containers, and we went with the same carpenters we always work with to assemble it in London. So it was a non-fictional assembly. It was exactly as if we were building a house in Chile. It was not representing anything scenographic. It was in itself a house within the museum. Then all the efforts are hidden. It's all covered with boards, simple pine woods, and doesn't show any indication of actual scale or effort.
This is another reference that perhaps you might know. It's what fascinates us is that it's a middle point between abstraction and realistic representation. There is a moment of tension. We did a second version of that. It's a painting, an oil painting, almost 2.5 meters. But it's basically to understand the work. In this case, it's again pointillism, but without any subject or any context. It's a simple action, a repetition of a minor gesture. So we're trying to avoid this notion of a grand gesture or a partie or anything that can predefine the execution of a work. So finally, the work is an addition of tiny and almost minor decisions that then are interrupted in a certain moment because of something that occurs. This is a project we did for more than 3 years. Yeah. It's a documentation of skies. It's 1 picture per day in any place at any time, and we collected, I don't know, more than 3,000.
No. Yeah, more than 1,000 and something.
But there was a moment of collapse because one day we forgot to take a picture of the sky, and we could have faked it with another picture, but we couldn't break our own rule. So there is something that is very limiting, but then liberating about the self-imposition of rules.
This is one of our earliest works, and I think it's a literal example of how we implemented our own method. It's a house for a normal family, and it occupies a plot that used to be where he grew up with a beautiful garden. So the first decision was to make 1 room, which is the wall that is around all the site, and that protects the house. And then the house extends horizontally in the site as a mud building, and it has 9 interior patios that regulate the density of that plan. So it's a large house, but it's actually the addition of small individual rooms, some of which happen to have a roof and some don't. So they capture in those patios existing trees and existing parts of the garden. That creates a sensation of sequences or alternating spaces inside the house that are always interior, exterior, interior, exterior, and give a larger sensation of space.
And that sense of generosity as well, it's in the section. We increase the height of some of the rooms. So they are equivalent to 2 stories, but then in order to avoid casting shadows in the patios, all the roofs descend towards the patios and towards the exterior perimeter. So there is an articulation of 2 geometries, the geometry of the ceiling and the geometry of the roofs, that are adapted to the furniture and the different activities inside. So that creates a very varied temperature of light inside at the same time.
And then within the house, all the different geometries are unified by this blanket of tiles that are just on top, and that were placed very rapidly. The only handcrafted part is the joint in the corners, where they were just cut. And this is a bit the way we work, which is with a criteria. This was the only plan that we had on site for the carpenters to build the trusses. So they knew the criteria, they knew the levels that they had to reach, but every single truss was then different and was entrusted to the carpenters. This is a drawing that was a documentation. Once they were built, we sent a German intern to draw what they had built.
So the elements of projects are this fence, the brick fence, the tiles, the green nature in between or inside the house. And then we receive a drawing made by the owner's son, and we were very fascinated by the precision of his perception and his mental image of his own house. So we have been for a long time trying to understand this conflict of up to what point architecture can be abstract and an artifice, an invention, and at the same time to be perceived with certain degree of naturality or as something very familiar and easy. This is a project very early that we did very early in our practice. It's in the coastline in a peninsula that runs parallel to the continent. It's running north-south. And the project is located in the west to the open ocean and as a final point of a natural promenade. So the site is surrounded by water in 3 sides. So the building is a very compact piece, almost as if it was abandoned there. But it occupies a very precise position, very far enough from the edge so as to be in a safe ground, but close to the edge so as to be able to look down and see the rocks and the waves.
The plan is organized. It's a double perimeter wall and then a cross inside. And this is this way because it is both a private house, but it's also a small cultural center that receives artists in residence who stay there for a while. So it has this function that has to be somehow more domestic and other times more neutral. In that perimeter wall, in that double wall actually, you have all the programs that are kitchens and bathrooms and closets, but also more architectonic programs such as staircases or balconies. And that allows for the center space to be freed. Everything can be stored in that double wall. So there's a very different perception of the thick mass created by the double wall, and then a very informal interior space in between that has always cardinal connections across the space with the landscape, but also because there is a difference in the floor, in the levels of the floor, it connects diagonally to some vanishing points with rocks or with the coast around it. So the surrounding landscape is really a reconstruction of fragments, a mental reconstruction as you go through the house.
Yeah, there is perhaps an obvious opposition between the abstract geometry of the piece and its wild nature, and a certain continuity between the granite of the rocks and the concrete. But we were interested in this cubic format because of this sensation of rest and gravity that is very attached to the ground, as a positive piece in a negative, or the opposite, a negative piece in a positive landscape without any mediation. So it's directly transferring the loads to the ground. Inside this monolithic and compact piece, there is a continuous vertical space, a void that acts as functions as a pivoting point, pivoting room for the interior, and it somehow captures a sense of vertigo of the cliff.
It was built very, very simply. This is a very ugly model, but we like it a lot. And it's essentially 7 stratums of concrete that were poured simultaneously. And it was built by the local fishermen and farmers, so it was a technology that was absolutely nothing new, all with wooden foamwork that then was recycled and used inside to cover the first exterior wall with a little bit of insulation, and then just white paint unified all of the interior. So it's just 15 centimeter thick concrete walls and slabs, and then 2 very simple details that are windows that are flush with the facade, and then others that are receded and that create protection from the wind in the winter, but also balconies in the summer. It works really well as a residence place. It's already building a collective memory in the area, but it also introduces a human scale to that context. It's a very idyllic context. Something that we have been exploring also with more suburban houses and much less idyllic context. These are houses that also explore the same notion of seclusion or compactness or autonomy, but trying to capture a little bit of the everyday beauty that you can have around them.
So in this not so ideal context, our position is very simple. It's basically the definition of a perimeter, of a line that defines a degree of transparency, and it's somehow elusive in the way of almost as a mask for what the interior space is. And this is connected with a series of portraits we're doing, which are a single line that defines the profile of a head, that then is repeated as an offset. I don't know if you can see Sophia there. There is a profile of Sophia. And can you see something?
I don't know if you see a blurry thing.
Yeah, there is a nose and the mouth there. So the individuality of the identity is diluted by the repetition of the same amount of elements, because the points are the same, the curves are the same, but they are expanding or compressing. And we find that in a suburban area, the limit that surrounds the interior, it's somehow doing the same function. So the context is very generic. It's this brand new suburb in a brand new city. It's just a topography without any tree. And the house is a compact piece. It's a 4 stories wooden box, very close and somehow hermetic to the surroundings.
But that compact figure is completely different inside. It's 15 platforms that rotate around the center. Each one is separated 70 centimeters from the other, so that's 4 steps. And it has a plan that is organized. Of course, here you see only 4 plans, but it's actually 15 different levels, which is a cross, an asymmetrical cross that holds all the fixed functions. And then in the crossing point of that is a staircase that connects all the rooms. So that staircase acts as a central core and an access to every room, but there's a secondary circuit you can take through the middle point of the room. So there's a short promenade and a longer one. And that same staircase allows for different views of the different levels, so you can connect diagonally through the whole volume of the house and have a perception of a larger house than it actually is.
The construction, it's not so complicated. In fact, the construction follow the form. It's a balloon frame construction with a core, a concrete core for the staircase. So it's a monolithic piece of in situ concrete for this spiral staircase that doesn't have any landing. All the steps are exactly the same.
So the staircase occupies exactly that center point, and it's a moment where it has also a void in the center, where it actually has the total height of the volume. Everything is made of wood, so it's almost, the rooms are almost a continuous furniture of untreated pine wood. And the same happens for the outside. It's a ventilated facade. In this case, it's just impregnated wood, and it's standing there with some leftover site, as opposed to the other houses, which are the same size, but they're somehow very obvious in their functions. They're very transparent of what is happening inside them.
This following project is more not so with problems, not so invented, but more dramatical. It's a project for some friends who lost their house in the earthquake that we had in Chile. So it was very delicate because we were asked to do a reconstruction that was a material reconstruction, but at the same time a mental reconstruction, which is something very demanding to have that kind of questions and dilemmas at the beginning of a project. So the construction is basically the structure that is there as an exposed finishing in a very simple and stable and manner, almost as if it was confirmed in that famous sentence by Simmel, this architecture considered as this meeting point or middle point between, or equilibrium point between the human forces and natural forces, which are different vectors.
The site where the house stands is a very small leftover site. It has this awkward shape and a very steep slope. So actually the footprint is very small. The place you can occupy is tiny. It's a 4 by 8 meters footprint, 6 pillars in the corners, a double beam in the center, and some diagonals that stabilize all of the structure. It's 8 equivalent rooms. 2 of them are in a blind podium that take the topography, and then 6 of them are in a crystalline tower. The staircase is linear, it's in the center, and it connects all the levels with absolutely no doors in between. So that the very narrow spaces, the privacy of it is regulated by a couple of layers of curtains. But what we like most is that when they're completely open, these curtains replace the black bones of the structure by these soft pillars of cloth.
And the structure doesn't show any effort. The columns and beams are exactly the same, 25 centimeters in steel, but there is a physical condition. They are different in every level inside, because the thickness of a metal, of a steel, is different, going from 10 millimeters, 8 and 6 millimeters. So there is a real entasis inside, but it's not visible. And then the construction is very simple. It's that the steel structure with 5 centimeters of a wooden floor without any structure, and then a couple of details for the openings, which were made in situ with steel angles for the fixed panel and the pivoting panel. So, and then everything is painted with black, the concrete and the steel. So it has this infrastructural presence with the elements that perhaps are too thick for the size of the house or too slender for concrete. So it's very undefined. The next project deals with something that is much more internal, as an internal problem, which is basically the systematization of a geometrical rule, which is the implied diagonal in an orthogonal system.
The house that Kirsten was just showing can be explained maybe with 3 coincidences that we like. One is, I don't know if you see it there, but it's you enter from behind to the house on the street, and there's a long staircase there. That's the first thing we liked. And then the second one is there's a coincidence with the levels. It's called 100 house. 100 is 100 in Spanish. And the podium is exactly 100 meters over sea level. And then the third coincidence was a very beautiful tree that is next to it, an old cypress. It's a building that articulates two formats. It's a vertical and a horizontal format, a tower and a podium. They're fused, so that the podium is very much in relation to the ground and is an extension to the ground, but the tower on top has distant views all the way to the ocean, far away. And it articulates three programs. One is a workshop in the lower level, then it's 3 levels of a house, and on top 3 levels of an office and a terrace. There are two, of course, independent circulation. One is the one that goes straight from the street and the highest point up to the tower, to the working space, and another one is an exterior staircase that goes down and connects internally the house with the workshop in the bottom. All the staircases are really shortcuts, extremely efficient, and ironically it's cypress stacked up, as if we're dialoguing with a cypress outside. But it's with no rails. It's actually the center core is the rail to the staircase.
And the plan of the whole house is a systematization of that Euclidean geometrical figure, which is like this asymmetrical cross in a square. So it's a repetition of 12 times the same figure that then is diluted by pragmatical reasons. So in the podium there are 6 modules, and in the tower 6 modules. And since the topography is left untouched, the total amount of levels is visible in the back garden, and then from the street it's totally hidden. That's the social area of the house, and you can see 3 modules there in the floor plan that then are open in the center, with the openings are aligned, and since there are certain steps, the openings are different in one extreme and the other, and that creates a subtle distortion of the depth of the perspective.
And as opposed to that extended floor plan, the tower is extremely compact. It's the same structure, but the relation of the spaces it articulates are always different. So if you look at the last 3 floor plans, the first one has a diagonal connection from the staircase across the totality of the volume. The next one has the longest possible path along the edges, or the top one is connected cardinally through the space in the center of that main room. So all the furniture is very linked to the openings, to the activities that are happening there. But as opposed to the house, this one is all painted in gray, and that gives all of the spaces in the office a very introspective and more boring quality that we enjoy. So it's a concrete building with a wooden house inside, all covering the walls. The outside is a monolithic concrete poured in situ. What we were interested in were the levels of concrete, not the texture of the foamwork. So a slight demolition gives it this quality of very soft edges. So it occupies a peripheral situation in the city, but it also has a diffuse presence. It's maybe too tall to be a house, but it's also too small to be an office building.
And this is a more recent project. We were painting this at the same time, and we find a perhaps beautiful connection between the painting and the project, because there is a degree of autonomy of what is depicted in the center, with the symmetry and the regularity. But at the same time, you cannot understand it without the context, the specificity of that relationship. It is a house in Spain. It's on top of a hill. It's a very gentle hill, and there is a very precise definition of the way in which you approach to the piece from the foot of a hill. There is the parking, and then there is a linear ascension from one moment to the final destination. That's the house on top of the hill. And as you can see, it's all covered with a dense forest. So that ascension occurs under the trees, so in the shadows. And somehow the house is the end point of a journey. So it's at the same time a suspension, not only of the piece in its relation with nature, but also there is something with the temporality of that linear experience and then the centralized experience of the interior. That's the final point of that arrival, which is very demanding, especially after 100 meters of a staircase. And then at that point you have to make a decision of entering by the corner, and there are two doors that arrives to the same place.
So this is the floor plan of that access. Both doors are equivalent, and they lead to these tunnels around a volume of water. That is the swimming pool. So you can take either direction and then arrive to another staircase, which is a spiral staircase in the opposite corner. What happens is that there are two windows in the swimming pool, in the volume of water, so the light inside this cave-like space is almost blue and green, but also as you go through it, you suddenly encounter in the water in a voyeuristic way the bodies that are submerged of other occupants in the house.
And the format of the house is very schematic. It's a blind podium with an open and transparent platform on top that contains a patio, an open room that has the same size of the podium. So the floor plan of the platform, it's basically the centralized structure with the water in the center, the spiral staircase in a corner, and it's very a close room in the center with punctual openings, and then the perimeter is basically punctuated by 16 columns. So in every side there is a room, an independent room that works as a pavilion, as a glass pavilion, and in the corners there are protected terraces in every one of the four corners. So the only proper room of the house is the patio, but obviously it doesn't have any roof. And the access to the pavilions is through a thick wall. It's perpendicular to the landscape, and the pavilions have this proportion that can be extended to the corners with the thick wall that is lateral of the central patio as a functional width.
So we could understand this house as a panoramic rotonda. It's equivalent in all its size, so it transforms that linear voyage of arriving to it into an three-dimensional sort of experience of the landscape around. But also the activities within the house can move and follow the sun or the absence of sun, depending on how people want to live. They can occupy the four corners of the four pavilions and shift around the house. That space around it is very narrow, so it's almost like a balcony. It is pushing you outwards, and that happens in an even more clear way. Those big panels of window can slide and invert the relation of what is interior and what is exterior. So the corners can be closed and the center pavilions can be open. That's a technical floor plan. The only distinction in material is the courtyard has Portuguese tile and the rest is a very simple concrete floor. But it's all in situ concrete. And what helps all of this rotonda cantilever is actually that the walls of the patio are extended and they make these firendel beams in the four sides. So actually, when you see this pillar, it's not actually a pillar, it's actually a tensor. There is inside a metal structure that pulls all the forces upwards and back into the courtyard and down into the earth. So the house is floating, suspended in the landscape with the company of this old tree. And we're always very aware of these invisible things. We want to, in a way, to understand that there is a physical presence of things, but there's also a mental aspect of them. And hopefully we try to connect with those two aspects in the work we're doing.
And this is a current project. We're working on a series of paintings and that in fact give the name to the lecture. We're really fascinated by, not only by the notion of format as a method, but by the notion of limitation, of something that is finite in terms of that you can restrict the amount of formal attributes of the elements that defines the spatial structure. So it's basically a series of studies of basic forms. In this case, for example, this L shape with 7 openings and with rectangular or square openings, with 5 sides, with 2 levels. And it's so simple, but we wanted to know how different and how diverse the same figure could be.
So now we are working on, it's maybe a very obsessive and alienating procedure, but we're enjoying it, and it's to establish in these very simple figures a format that is based on 3, well, in this case it's 5 factors and 3 positions. So actually we are mathematically exhausting the possibilities of this figure. In the case of these 5 factors and 3 positions, the total variations we can get is 243. So it's just a combination of all of those, which then somehow we find fascinating, because just a slight variation of some proportion or a size of one element or one part of it defines a very different character, a very different identity for every single one of the figures, while they're still all the same.
And basically what we have been continually doing is repeating this obsessive manner of repeating every time more or less the same ideas and we truly believe that the understanding of architecture is based on the understanding of your own method, of your own shortcut to do and to produce what you do. There is an Argentinian poet that used to say that in order to do art, you have to do always the same thing, but never in the same way. Thank you.
Thank you.